And now for the closing general session of the 2012 Charter Schools Conference. We are so very proud to host what is sure to be an engaging discussion on California's K-12 education and some of the most important educator leaders in Sacramento. They're backstage. I saw them. They're here. We're excited. We want you to participate in today's discussion. And there should be index cards on your seats. Hopefully you have those, something to write with. So please write down your questions that come to hand during this discussion time, and then we're going to be followed up with a question and answer session. So please help me welcome to today's participants to the stage. First of all, the president of the California State Board of Education, Mike Kirst. Welcome, sir. Second of all, we have the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tom Torlakson.
Good to see you. Thanks for coming here.
And our moderator for today's discussion is the education blogger and editor, John Fensterwald. And of course, we have California's 41st Assembly District Assembly Education Committee Chair, Assemblywoman Julia Brownley.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Very much.
So at this point, let the discussion begin.
So we really hit the trifecta today, and with three key leaders in the legislature, the head of the State Board of Education, and also the California Department of Education. So who says you guys don't rate and aren't important? The only person who's not here is one person, but he's got your back, I understand, so we're covered. So Tom, Mike, and Julia, we have a lot to talk about in a very short time. So we wanted to focus our discussion. But first, why don't you take a couple minutes, each of you, to talk about your key priority in your respective roles. And Tom, why don't you start?
Well, thank you, and good day, Charter School Association. And it's been great meetings we've had between my staff and your staff, and Jed and Cynthia, in terms of productive ways to move forward and keep communicating. A lot of priorities, a lot to juggle right now. I'll just point to the Blueprint for Great Schools, which talks a lot about our variety of strategies, innovative, creative ways that we know work for kids' success, that you're practicing, that are being practiced in public schools across California. But the programmatic is an action plan for what to do, but the top priority I have is dealing with the financial crisis that is in our school system. As you know, 20% has been lost in the last 4 years. 20% of the public school funding, $18 billion, has been taken away. I declared a state of financial emergency when I first took office, first week. Many of you joined in saying, let's pay attention. Bad things are happening in terms of the detrimental cutbacks. We wanted to call out the National Guard. We couldn't do that, we found out, but we did, I think, change the conversation. We sounded the alarm. For a lot of the public, the lights are on, the doors are open, the school appears to be normal, but we know it's been shortened in the school year, the school day in some cases. The nurses, librarians, specialists that were there before, the counselors aren't there. We have suffered some great setbacks, and sounding that alarm's been important. Traveling up and down the state, we've been able to put a spotlight on where that harm has come home to affect the education of our students, but we've also put a spotlight on great things that are going on. And despite all the craziness of the pink slips and layoffs and changes and cuts, we are seeing great progress in California. One of the things that we're looking at, however, is what's in front of us this year in this budget. So if the governor's plan for the budget and the accompanying ballot measure does not pass, education faces another $5 billion cut. That's another 10% for all of us. How can we do this? It's just looking impossible because all the other one-time tricks and reserves sources have disappeared in this time. So we are out making this the top priority. I'm going across the state saying we need to invest. Don't we need to invest in our schools again? Californians today aren't paying the same level of taxes we were 10 years ago into our schools. We're paying about $10 billion less in taxes into California programs, and we need that money back. So I'm saying let's raise those taxes, let's go to the voters, let's have an historic conversation we haven't had for at least a half century as to where are we going in public education in California. And I urge you all to join us. I know the Charter School Association has gotten out front in terms of one of the ballot measures. I'm supporting all three right now. I think we could use every dime from every one of them and spend it well. I do think, though, that it's going to come down to having one on the ballot that we'll all rally behind. As Cameron said earlier, get out there and meet with your mayors and your community and your business leaders and tell them the good things that are going on, because I think we have to be proactive and not just say the sky is falling and we have these dreadful cuts in front of us. Let's celebrate and put a spotlight on the great things that are going on. As I've traveled the state, that's the most inspiring thing, is to see great schools in work, like High Tech High in San Diego, students exploring the Bay and discovering new things. The Academy in Math Science Technology Academy and the Alliance for College Ready Schools. The kids are engaged, excited, and we need more of that, but we have a financial emergency, and that's my top priority.
Good, thanks, Tom. So Julia, despite the bleak finances, a lot is happening in the legislature and in the Assembly and in your committee. So looking ahead this year, what's your priority?
Well, thank you very much. I do also want to tell everybody how grateful I am for your hard work that you do every single day on behalf of California's children. I'm well aware of how difficult and challenging your jobs are and how hard you work on a day-to-day basis. So I just want to say thank you very, very much for that. And I really want to be your partner in helping to support your good efforts to make sure that children in California are successful in school and go on to great careers and do great things for California. I think clearly, as Tom said, there's never a moment where we're not advocating, and I'm not advocating for adequate funding for California schools. There is no reason in the world that we should be 48th amongst the rest of the states in terms of funding, and we just need to do a lot better with that. Ever since I have been in the legislature, and my priority today is the same priority I had when I came to the legislature, and that is around reforming our school finance system. And I strongly believe that we have a school finance system that is irrational, inadequate. It makes no more sense. There's no more relevance, if you will, in terms of how we invest our educational dollars. There's no more nexus as it relates to student outcomes. So I think we have to take an old, antiquated system that has been cobbled together over the last 3 decades and completely take it off the table and rebuild one that really makes sense in terms of investing each one of our educational dollars in a way that will give us the greatest outcome, and of course that is student achievement. So I have been working on this, very encouraged that the governor has suggested this as one of his priorities in terms of reforming our school finance system, and I think the governor and I are philosophically in alignment. I'm carrying a bill, AB 18, that is supported by Tom Torlakson, and we're working together on this bill to move a bill forward to the governor's desk this year. We've made a lot of progress. We're working with the Charter School Association, and we still have more work to do on this bill, but it's really important work to do it. If we can reform this system, we can create a much more accountable system. Clearly, we have a huge financial gap in California. I call it a financial gap or an equity gap, and that financial gap mimics the achievement gap. So we need to close that through a weighted student formula. If we transform and simplify a system, we will gain much better transparency. Imagine if we could actually see how the money flows from Sacramento to school districts, and then how school districts make decisions and how each individual school allocates their funding. Very, very important. And so we will gain the equity issues that we need. We will achieve the transparency we need, and ultimately a better accountability. And now is the right time to change that system so that when we move ahead and we recover in our economy and on the natural, new monies come into the system, those new monies will be distributed on a weighted basis that will begin to narrow and close that financial gap, and we will improve achievement overall.
Good,
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, I will revisit this in a minute because I know Mike Kirst actually has been intricately involved in this as well. But before we do that, Mike, I just wanted to give you a chance to talk. I'm amazed at the extent of the agenda. Every meeting you have a lot on your plate. So what's by the end of the year, what is it that you want to accomplish?
Right. I'll pick one thing as you specified. I do. First, I do appreciate being here as well. The State Board spends a lot of time and analysis on charter school issues. Our liaison from the State Board of Education, member Trish Williams, attended your convention and is here in the audience. I will focus on the implementation systematically across the schools of California, the Common Core curriculum. This is the biggest change in curriculum that we've had in a long time. It is as people have said, it's based on the California curriculum in some ways, but it goes very far beyond it. It's going to be a huge undertaking. You have three things to develop: the Common Core curriculum itself. We're still filling in, some of the details of that through, and we will through curricular frameworks. Then we're going to, by law, align the English language standards to the Common Core curriculum. Those standards have existed as somewhat separate from the other standards we've had. And third, as part of the Common Core curriculum, we have to develop a radical new assessment program and implement that by 2014-2015 through our participation in the interstate consortium called Smarter Balanced. So if you look at the work that the board has in policy development and the CDE together, it's formidable. We have to develop a curriculum framework. You don't want a bunch of standards just without filling it in, how to teach it and give it some more depth. Then we obviously have to develop instructional materials that go along with that. Yeah, I think and agree with Assemblywoman Brownley, we need to overhaul our too cumbersome instructional materials adoption process. That's a huge undertaking. We need to then look at the Smarter Balanced assessment. That will be computer adaptive. We have to adjust then to being able to have the schools able to administer computer adaptive assessment, which is exciting, and it will tell you a lot more about what students do know and not just primarily what they don't know. And then we have to begin and really carry out in depth professional development. That has to come soon, because if we're going to have the assessment come online in 2014-2015, you need the professional development to precede that. So the sequencing of this is very difficult. And then we have to persuade our colleagues at the California Teacher Commission that new teachers should be thoroughly able to teach the Common Core curriculum. So I could go on and on with this. We do have a master plan before us on the State Board next Wednesday, drawn up by CDE. But this is a gigantic undertaking, and it's not going to work unless it gets into the classroom.
Yeah, so you mentioned in the old days of a decade ago, there was a sequence and there was an order to this, and you would start with the standards and the curriculum frameworks, then the instructional materials, and then the professional development, and then you'd have a test. So now it seems like everything is coming together at once. And if I were a charter school, if I were a district, I'd be saying, what do we do? Anybody?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Start.
Well, I'll say, for one, that this is a very important journey for the state of California. And to some degree, I think everything has to happen at once because we're sort of on a fast track, although we have to be extremely thoughtful and careful. And as Mike said, this is a huge undertaking. I also think that it is important why we stay on parallel tracks, which is to heal our budget and begin investing in education, but then doing the important work and setting the foundations for improving our delivery of education in every single classroom. So I think from my vantage point, that's, I think, what is happening here. We're on two parallel tracks: economic recovery, and then trying to really put the important foundations in place for us to move forward and ahead. So we will move ahead in a more forceful way and be more successful.
Yeah, so there's an interim instructional materials process that's coming up, right? So in this time of the internet and a lot of communication and different ways of communicating, will this interim process really replace the formal instructional materials adoption? And in fact, will districts have a lot more freedom in charter schools basically to go out there and see what's best across the nation and say, this is what we want to do, state board, let us do it?
Well, I think, as Mike said, and Julia said, we need to streamline the current process, and I think we have a tremendous opportunity. We have to do all these things at once. Partly we're slowed up in sequencing them or unpacking them a little bit differently because of the budget process and the freeze that's been put on developing curricular materials. But I think one of the greatest advantages here, a game changer, is that we're going to go digital. I want to see the state go digital, and that, to hand students a textbook that goes through a process of 5 years, and maybe they get it in the 6th year after it's been, written. It's very outdated. And so I think both the computer adaptive testing that Dr. Kirst mentioned is part of what we have to do with the new assessment for the Common Core standards. We're doing a survey right now of where the gaps are in the technology, in the bandwidth and the internet connecting devices. How are we going to administer these tests? But I think it's going to move us towards the digital age. And we're working with the publishers, stop mowing down trees. Let's get together and figure out how to go digital, and then that material will be available much sooner. And that's the lessons for the students, but it's also lessons in professional development for the teachers. And so with my department, the CDE, has gone out. We're generating supplemental materials that will be a bridge between the old standards and the new standards that districts can and charter school organizations can go out and purchase. But the regular textbook adoption and curricular process is in the state board's hands.
Well, and I'm also carrying a bill to reform that process, of which school districts would acquire instructional materials, and trying to completely revamp that process with the notion of giving districts a lot more flexibility in terms of the instructional materials that they want, right. A faster process, if you will, that both the superintendent and the state board would be involved with, but most importantly, really giving the districts that flexibility. And it is very exciting what's happening relative to textbooks and digital, the technology and digital textbooks. I just, the Apple and some of the textbook publishers were in my office the other day showing some of the new books that Apple will be producing, and it's very exciting, very, very exciting things. I dissected a frog on an iPad, and it was, I did a pretty good job.
So
congratulations.
Basically, what's the word to schools? I mean, and quickly, sort of, what should they be doing now? Should it be waiting for the state to provide guidance, or what?
I think you need to move ahead. We're not going, it's too big a state for us to stage manage all of this from the state. Remember, the Common Core has been adopted by 46 states. We're no longer on our own on devising our assessments and on devising and improving our instructional materials. There's in effect a common market out there. So in the spirit of charter schools, since this is the audience here, I think you should be looking at experimenting and looking at materials that are available. This supplemental adoption will help. But that's what the publishers sort of have lying around that might match the Common Core. That's not all new stuff that they've been developing. So some states and some localities are moving faster than some in California. So look out there for what there is. And I think at this point you should be building awareness of all your staff of what the Common Core is, the challenges it will outline. You should begin by giving them some ideas about how this will result in new teaching, some units they can maybe get a feel for. You should be giving them some exposure to new types of assessments that are more performance-based, that are not closed-end moldable choice. And I think charter schools as innovators should I'd like to see some of you really go whole hog in implementing Common Core quite quickly and then calling our attention to it in terms of what you're doing. And we can learn from you and you can learn from us, but we're not going to have some stage-managed, piece-by-piece rollout that you need to wait for.
Good, thanks. So let's go back to weighted student formula, if we will. And so, Mike, you co-authored a study with Goodwin Liu and Alan Burson on which the current weighted student formula is based, and yet there are some fundamental differences in the way the one that the governor is proposing, and from what you offered, regional cost differences, but mainly there's not a hold harmless per se, and I've written about it, and I looked at the first projections of the impacts on schools, and there are some districts that by the end of 2017-18, they really wouldn't get any more than they're getting today, which of course is 10-15% less than they got 3-4 years ago. And I mean, Tom, I'm sure your phone was off the hook because some of those districts are in Contra Costa County. So Mike, I mean, looking at it now, what do you think needs to be fixed, if you think it does, in order for it to be passed possibly this year?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't exactly trust all these numbers you're seeing. I think we're still, there's some disjuncture between the numbers that the state is producing and the numbers districts are producing, and I'm not sure some of the districts understand exactly how this would work. The basic thing is that this is a bold proposal that has many important moving parts, and we're discussing, we're finding things that we didn't know about before, and we're adapting and negotiating and looking at these sorts of things. The difference between the hold harmless is that the proposal the governor's making has a first-year hold harmless, then a long, very slow phase-in, and so the phase-in, which is only 5% phase in the first year it's operating, is really, I think, also a way of holding things harmless. And you could work with both a hold harmless idea or with a phase-in idea. So I think our intent is not to cut districts from the base they have now and all of that. I would point out to me that to this audience that I think the weighted pupil formula has significant advantages to charter schools, and you should take a very close look at this. I can't figure out any charter school that would be worse off under this at this point. I wanted to mention that before this specific audience.
Mm-hmm. So Julia, you've worked on this for a year.
A lot of time.
And so you've already gotten a lot of feedback from districts that are saying, I want more money. And so what's the lesson that you've learned after having worked on it a year, seeing the governor's proposal? What do you think needs to change?
Well, I think the issue that you're raising right now, the hold harmless piece, is an important one. And it's the hold harmless piece and the speed at which we kind of close in on this gap that I talked about earlier. And I think that's an area where we're going to have probably a lot of negotiations between the governor and the legislature on this. I mean, we have to understand that over the last couple of years, there's been about a $20 billion cut to schools. So school districts, charter schools are way behind in terms of the funding that they deserve and where they should be. So we've got to wrestle with that issue of of putting the resources back into schools that they have already lost, and then how do we transform into a system where we weight our new dollars or existing dollars. I mean, are we going to take the $20 billion and weight that through? Are we going to recover school districts at the $20 billion and then new money's coming in and weight that through? Or are we going to take somewhere in between? And I think that's, a discussion that we're going to have in the legislature. And I think from my vantage point, again, working with stakeholders for a very long time on this issue, if we start out on without a hold harmless, you have 50% of the districts who are winners and 50 that are losers, and that's DOA in the legislature because 50% of the legislators are going to support their school districts and either going to be on the yay side or the nay side. So I think that's something that we're absolutely going to have to work out. I think a smaller detail as it relates to charter schools is going to have to be looked at as well, because the governor's proposal has this sort of base funding that is one funding to everyone, and the way charter schools are funded it's based on whether they're an elementary school, middle school, high school, so there's some degradation there going relative to the needs. And so again, with that one type of funding coming from Sacramento with charter schools, depending on whether you're elementary or whether you're high, there are also going to be winners and losers. So we have to thoughtfully think through that process too.
Right, and there's another part of this, and again, I heard testimony before your committee last year, and that is, the weights are primarily geared so that low-income and English learners, the districts with those concentrations, get more money. So what's the assurance that the money would be spent on these children? It goes to the district office, and I know, Julia, lots of advocacy groups have already raised this issue. So, Tom, do you have some thoughts on that?
Well, you have to have that accountability. I think the idea the governor has, again, is bold. The work that Julia's been doing is bold work. What's good is the debate's changed as to whether we should change the system to how to change the system of accountability, and so I think that's critically important. And phasing it in so there aren't losers in the process is critical. But we need to have accountability for the outcomes and not sort of micromanage the input of the money the way the current system does. And so I think any end product legislation really has to say, if you're getting your weighted student formula dollars, you have to take care of those English learners. You have to deal with the students from poverty who have a lot of catch-up to do in most cases. So that's fundamental. And I testified last week in the Senate to the governor's proposal that schools should be treated alike. And so the base funding in the governor's proposal, I think, should also go to charter schools and county office schools as well as to regular schools, so that all the public schools in California are treated equally.
Right. Now, Julie, I think what... That one resonated. So Julia, you sort of approached a little bit of a hybrid, kind of a block grant approach, because, and partly due to this feeling that the dollars should be more accountable. Am I right? Or
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the sort of the architecture, if you will, of AB 18 is to have this base level of funding, collapsing of the categoricals as we know it, and having a baseline of funding, then having a sort of a block grant ensuring that all of those categorical funds, EIA and other kinds of things, go into a block grant to ensure that those monies stay with students who come from poverty or are English language learners. And then we have another block grant, which we call the Quality Instruction Grant, and that is to ensure that monies are going directly to the classroom, clearly, to support teachers, to support the right conditions for teaching and learning. So yes, my architecture is a little bit different from the governor's to ensure that existing monies are going to these important places. Quality instruction, ensuring that children who already are getting a lift through categorical money as it relates to poverty and English language learners continue to get that lift. Obviously, the goal as we move forward, that we still know that there's that big gap that's there, and as we move forward, new money's beginning to fill in that gap over time.
So Mike, we've talked before about this, and I think you have a little different take on flexibility, why flexibility is important, and how it's different now from when you arrived here 30 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, we have spent a lot of effort on the past in specifying how schools do business. We have a very large education code. We have 62 categoricals. The last time we had money in the state was 2006, and the governor and the legislature in their wisdom created 22 new categorical programs and refunded 5 that had lapsed. So I think it's important that, we get here while we're nitpicking the proposal. Who is defending, the 62 categories and adding 20 more the next time we have money? So I think if you don't move forward, you're going to move backwards in this regard. The governor's proposal has fewer restrictions on how the districts spend the money. Because as Tom indicated, we're focusing less on how you spend your money and much more on what your results are. And it is the proposal of weighted pupil formula is raising the issue of a stronger accountability system, and so that's also on the agenda. We can arrange for clearer transparency. One of the things the board is working on is a huge overhaul of the school accountability report card. It's festooned with 45 variables, and nobody can make any sense out of it. We're talking about reducing it to 10 to 15, putting various kinds of fiscal reporting in there at the school level. That's transparency, not controlling how you spend the money, right. which is another alternative that Assemblywoman Brownley talked about. So I think this is very interesting. But I do urge charter school people to take a very careful look at the governor's proposal, because it has several advantages in there for charter schools in giving you a base. It includes you then more in the categorical programs. Many of you do better through the weighting system, most of you. There's also a proposal in the governor's budget to reimburse you for mandates. Some of those have never been reimbursed for you. And you're essentially moved up to the base of the other districts. We don't have a lower base for charter schools. So this is a fairly big change, and one you need to look at, because it does redo your formula and does make it the same as everybody else's, basically.
Let me just touch on accountability for a little bit longer, and that is, so the assumption is you will base things on results. That's the whole idea behind flexibility. But the measures we have right now are the California Standardized Test and the API, and which is a narrow measure of what a school is doing. And I know that there's a lot of discussion now about changing what the accountability metrics should be. Any thoughts? And Mike, I know it's before the State Board, and Tom and Julia.
Yeah, Tom.
Well, as many of you know, I worked with Darrell Steinberg, President Pro Tem of the Senate last year, on a bill which the governor philosophically disagreed with the way we presented it, but it's back in a slightly changed form, and that debate will go on. In other words, for example, John, and you mentioned this, if you're just measuring the bubble test results in math and English language arts, you're missing a lot of other ingredients of what makes for a successful school. And if a school is very good at helping students who are at risk and on the edge of dropping out stay, will their test scores go up at the pace that others? No, because that 100 students they save and keep involved will have a lower academic background to test on. So adding, for instance, that element of how are you doing with dropouts, and what are you doing, how well are you doing in closing the achievement gap? Maybe another measurement. How well are you doing to prepare young people for career pathways? So the set of ingredients, I think, should be broadened over the two main ones that make up current API, and that debate goes on. And we urge the Charter School Association and individual charter schools to bring your ideas to us on how that should be accomplished.
There's no question the accountability piece is a really important piece, and it's a very complex piece. I certainly agree with what Tom said. We want a broader accountability. The whole issue around Common Core is to get deeper into the curriculum as opposed to a mile wide and an inch deep. We are going to have common assessments with the rest of the country and benchmarks so that we can assess how our students are doing with the rest of the country and, quite frankly, for the rest of the world. So all of this has to be incorporated, I think, into a comprehensive accountability system. And also, we don't know what the reauthorization and what Washington is going to be doing relative to ESEA. So there's a lot of complexities here, I think, that we have to really look at and work on. But I do think we want to move beyond an accountability system that's based on the API. We want a much broader way of assessing our students and their success. But there's no question that it is critically important that we transform a finance system that is going to support student learning and begin to close this achievement gap. I mean, we're working on closing the achievement gap, but if we don't have the finance system that supports it, it's just going to drag us down. And so it's really very important that we work on this.
So, Mike, I know this whole accountability issue will be before the state board this year, and in the governor's veto of Darrell Steinberg's bill that Tom also supported and worked on, there was this mention of school inspections or school visitations or what?
Yeah, that's a work in progress. We're looking, the California itself has done many school visits. We have distinguished schools programs. We have had various reviews for school effectiveness under No Child Left Behind. We have been searching in other states in terms of how they do school visits, what they do with school visits. There are two states that very specifically I would mention. You have Massachusetts and New York, who review charter schools, for example, through school visits, and have extensive protocols. We've looked at those in detail. The state board, let me give you an example. The state board is charged under our regulations with closing some charter schools at some point. I'd sure like to go out and look at those before I close them, rather than looking at 5 numbers in my office with my colleagues for the board. So to give you a concrete example, before you close a school, maybe you ought to go out and look at it. And then you need a protocol as to what you look at. And so this is an example that we would tie it initially around specific decisions we have to make.
Good, thanks. So we want to turn this over to you as well for your questions. Colin and Cynthia.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. We did collect some questions from the audience, as well as we asked our members to email questions before the session. So this one came in from email. Deferrals and other budgetary challenges are crippling charter schools all over the state. What can you do to help improve that, from using existing funds to deferral relief in the next budget?
Wow.
I think it's Utah.
We're doing as much as we can, and again, I go back to my commentary on the priority. We have to get some additional money in the system. We have to restore the dollars that used to be invested. We were once in the top 5 in the nation. Now we're 47th or 48th on which day of the week we're checking that investment per pupil. And the states that are investing more per pupil are doing wonderfully well academically. They're soaring with their student proficiencies and success. In the Department of Education, we're working to try to deal with that issue, even in terms of getting the revolving loan fund, for instance. We're not getting as many of the payments on the same schedule we used to get it because of the deferrals. So the deferrals have really been unfair. I know it was done in the emergency situation we were in, but you're putting all districts, many districts school districts are going out and borrowing money at very high cost, and now they can't go back and borrow anymore. So the deferral system is ready to fall apart, I think, and it's harming charter schools and regular school districts alike.
Yeah, I would mention the governor's put several proposals in his budget proposal to specifically aimed at some of the charter school problems where they have less credit availability and more problems with short-term cash flows than some of the large districts, for example. So I would urge the person who asked that question to look carefully at what's in the governor's budget and see whether that does assist them.
We received a handful of questions regarding relationships with authorizers. Far too many school districts see charter schools as competitors and therefore oppose them. If you believe choice and competition are good, do you support alternative authorizers for charter schools, as called for in the Little Hoover report?
Could someone elaborate on what an
Yeah.
alternative authorizer means, just to give us a more concrete framework?
Typically, when they talk about alternative independent authorizers, independent of school districts, there are many different models. Some might be a state commission, maybe regional commissions, things like that. Colleges, universities, sometimes.
I'd look to work with the Charter School Association to see what examples you think would be worthwhile to look at.
Well, Mike, you've talked about the amount of time that appeals take before your board. Is an alternative authorizer an option instead of coming to you?
I think we're coping with it now adequately, and I don't think we're at this point of being overloaded. I did read the Hoover Commission report very carefully, and they projected a very big workload for the State Board of Education in the future. And if that happens, and it just simply overwhelms our time, we can either meet more or do something different. Right now, we're relying on the the Advisory Committee on Charter Schools heavily for advice. And if we continue to take their advice, then that will enable us to have the flow. There was an authorizer bill which the legislature turned down, probably when Assemblywoman, maybe it was before your time. Governor Brown was the mayor of Oakland and came with the endorsement of Governor, at that time, Gray Davis, to let mayors charter schools. That's an alternative authorizer. I think there were universities and maybe some others in there that could charter schools. Maybe that's what the question's more speaking about, and at this point, I really don't have a position on that. It's still heavily a locally based process, and we do have the state doing statewide benefit charters. So that issue has not arisen as an urgent issue for me to consider at this point.
And I would just like to comment, since I haven't had a chance, and I just want to say that I haven't read the Little Hoover Commission report, so I need to look and study that. But I will say that I am very open to policy recommendations that are going to leverage high-performing schools, high-performing charter schools. I do think that we need to ensure that at least the initial application has the right ingredients for charter schools to be successful. And but that's kind of from my vantage point. I'm looking for high-performing schools, both charter schools and traditional schools, and anything that we can do to help leverage that process. And I do understand, I get this issue of perhaps some districts not being so friendly to charter schools, and how we kind of approach that in the right way. It's always hard to get policy just right, but I would certainly be open to looking at those issues.
Thank you. Here's a question from the audience today. Special education has become a significant a topic of concern for both traditional and public schools and charter schools alike. Is there a forum where the legislature, CDE, and school boards are discussing these issues, and what's going on in the special ed environment?
Well, my department has a special education advisory committee that's linked into special education programs around the state and invite further participation by Charter School Association. It's a huge problem. Some call it encroachment, but it's a conflict in the budgets. The rapid increase of autism being diagnosed and has created a new workload, a new set of costs. One thing we need to do is rally together to have our congressional delegation and our U.S. senators fight for the federal government to fully fund the Special Education Act. It's only, I think, received about 20 to 30% of the funding over the many years that it's been in existence. And so as we go through the reauthorization of ESEA, we need to have a common voice to say, federal government, give us the money to match the mandate for the level of service we're providing.
Yeah, the answer I would give at the state level is essentially no at this point, and it's my biggest surprise in coming back on the state board after having chaired it in the early 80s. Then we spent an enormous amount of time on overhauling special education, and we did the Special Education Master Plan. When I left the board in '82, it was special ed was 11% of total expenditures. It's now about 23%. Of course, the base has shrunk. The autism chart is like that, with no end in sight, going up as one example. So I think I've been exploring, but have no clear strategy yet, how we can look at more prevention. We have districts and schools all over the map in the percentage that are in programs of special education. Long Beach, for example, is consistently half of all the surrounding districts. What do? They involve themselves in a lot of response to intervention, a lot of prevention. But we need to get a hold of this, and I think it's an issue that does require some important areas and important exploration. We spent some time on the board on this, but it's extremely complex, and I think something needs to happen before it becomes 30% of our budgets. And,
I would agree with all the comments that have been made, and what I would just add is that I also think, particularly with this issue with autism, the health arena, the medical arena, insurance companies particularly, I think have to be better partners with the school communities, because we need to really recognize this issue of autism and addressing it at its earliest stage, perhaps before children even enter our school system. And so there is a lot of work, I think, that needs to be addressed in that area, and it's going to take a lot of advocacy both here at the state level and at the federal level to accomplish those things.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have one last question from the audience. What is the biggest challenge charter schools face in the next 2 years?
Well, I'll say again, which I think is obvious, but the financial issues, my department's been cut, your budgets have been cut. We're trying to move money out to fund the facilities grants and the charter school grants and the revolving loan fund. It's hard without the staff to do it as proficiently as we'd like to do it. But we all need, again, to band together, to work in our communities, to work with our neighbors, all organizations we're attached to, our churches and synagogues, our business alliances, Seroptimus and Kiwanis and Rotary. We need a full-on debate in California about, are we willing to invest in education? And we can't just keep hobbling along and looking at further drastic cuts. It's been paralyzing some in the education community. It's been upsetting to all of us. And so I do believe that's the biggest challenge charter schools face in unison with all public education.
Here, and I mean, charter schools, we have more charter schools here in California than any other place, as we should, because we're the largest state. But I think the struggles, we all share the same struggles, and particularly all of you who are really focused on our disadvantaged students, our at-risk students. These are huge challenges you've made lots of progress. We continue to make lots of progress, but making sure that we're addressing all of those students' needs, and obviously our obligation to you is to give you the resources that you need to do the job properly, because we know with all the right conditions there, and that takes money, but having the right conditions, we know that each and every student in California can be highly successful, provided we're giving you the tools necessary to do your jobs well.
Yeah, I would say as well, fiscal survivability, and I think that the way one way to help with that is, of course, the tax initiative, and the charter schools have endorsed the governor's proposal. So I think that's one way to move forward. The other, I would say, is if there, my unsolicited advice is, if there's a major finance proposal out there called weighted pupil formula that gives you a better deal in the long run, take a hard look at it.
Good advice as we close our session. Time's gone very quickly. Julia, Tom, Mike, thanks for coming and joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks.